Hello everyone, greetings from Istanbul. As the Secretary of the Center for Ottoman Malay World Studies at Fatih Sultan Mehmet Vakıf University in Istanbul, Turkey, we have a distinguished guest today. I am honored to introduce one of the leading scholars in the field of Malay studies, Dr. Annabel Gallup. She is the head of the Southeast Asia section at the British Library, and also in 2019, she was elected as a fellow in the British Academy. Her main research interests are Malay manuscripts, letters, documents, seals, and the art of beautifying decorative elements and art of illumination in these manuscripts. She has many published work in this field, and her most recent work, and perhaps her masterpiece, is Malay Seals from the Islamic World of Southeast Asia, published by National University of Singapore Press in 2019. She is currently continuing her research in the Quranic manuscripts and often shares her experience in her Twitter account and enables us to follow her progress. Digitization of the manuscripts is also another work she is carrying out, and it is also an important service and contribution to the academic memory of the Malay studies. Today, she will tell us the story of Hajj, the pilgrimage from Southeast Asia, through these manuscripts, and also the Ottoman artistic influence on these manuscripts. Thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Gallup. Now we are all listening to you.
Thank you very much for that very kind introduction, Mr. Kopp, and I'm absolutely delighted to be talking and joining you at OSMAD today. I'm going to share my screen. So there, I hope you can see that now.
Yes.
So, as announced earlier, my talk is on the Hajj from Southeast Asia. But what I'm not going to be doing today is giving you a full history of the Hajj, the pilgrimage from Southeast Asia, because as Mr. Kopp explained, my field is manuscripts and other cultural objects from the Malay world. And I study them in order to see what they can tell us about the cultures that created them. And as I was working on this topic of the Hajj from Southeast Asia, I realized that for much of the period for which we have sources documenting the pilgrimage, in fact, the holy cities of Mecca and Medina were under Ottoman control following the defeat of the Mamluks in 1517. And so I entitled my talk today, The Hajj from Southeast Asia, a story in sources from Ottoman times. But I'm going to start with the very earliest times, and my narrative will be embedded in sources, in written sources such as inscriptions, books, documents, and seals, and other cultural artifacts which testify to the long history of the pilgrimage to Mecca from the Malay maritime world of Southeast Asia. But at the end of my talk, I will also consider Ottoman influence on Malay manuscript art. So these prospective pilgrims in Lok Semawe, Aceh, photographed in 2013, are practicing the tawaf or circumambulation of a model of the Kaaba, and they're preparing for a journey which nowadays only takes a matter of hours or at the most a few days in an aeroplane. And in fact, Indonesia is the country which sends the largest number of pilgrims to Mecca from any country in the world on the annual Hajj, with many more coming from the other countries of Southeast Asia, including Malaysia, Singapore, Brunei, and the Philippines. So pilgrims have always undertaken the Hajj from Southeast Asia over the centuries, albeit not in such large numbers as nowadays, because they had to travel further and far longer than pilgrims from almost anywhere else on the globe, as evoked by the title of a recent book on the Hajj from Southeast Asia by Eric Tagliacozo, entitled The Longest Journey. Now, it's difficult to say when the Hajj began from Southeast Asia because there are so few sources from the early period, but there were probably Muslims living and trading in Southeast Asia from the very earliest days of Islam. And proof of this very early Arab presence in Southeast Asia came with the discovery in 1998 of the Belitung shipwreck. This was a shipwreck off the coast of Belitung, the island of Belitung in Sumatra, of a 9th century Arab ship, a dhow, which was made of wood, which has been carbon dated and assigned to Oman or that region, which was carrying a cargo of tongue ceramics and other treasures back to the Middle East from China. The find comprised the largest collection of tongue wares, which is now held outside China, and it's currently on display in the Asian Civilizations Museum in Singapore. But the existence of this trade network means that there must have been small communities of Muslims living all over Southeast Asia for many centuries, for merchants would have needed to wait for many months for the monsoon winds to change for their return journeys back westwards across the Indian Ocean. But the main wave of Islamization in Southeast Asia is generally marked or judged by the institutionalization of the faith, which came about with the conversion of kings or rulers of states. And this process started in the 13th century, not surprisingly, on the northern tip of the island of Sumatra, which is the area which is the westernmost part of the archipelago and the part closest to the Middle East and India. So the wave spread eastwards over across the archipelago, with the kingdoms of South Sulawesi becoming probably the last bastion to convert to Islam in the early 17th century. And the earliest material witnesses to the Islamization of the region are inscriptions on stone, which are nearly always tombstones. But in fact, the earliest inscription on stone is not a tombstone. It's a very well-known, very large inscription from Trengganu on the east coast of Sumatra. It's generally referred to as the Trengganu stone. And it was issued by a local ruler setting out Islamic laws. And it's written in the Malay language, written in Arabic script. And it's the earliest known inscription in Arabic script, which was produced in Southeast Asia. But we know absolutely nothing of the polity or the ruler that produced this stone. We do know rather more about the kingdoms in North Sumatra, including the earliest kingdom known to have converted to Islam, Pasai in North Sumatra, because they have a very rich tradition of funerary monuments, tombstones, many of them with inscriptions, but these inscriptions are nearly always completely in Arabic without any elements in Malay. And there are examples of exceptional beauty. These stones are normally called Batu Aceh or Achenese stones, but they vary in shape, and it's possible to tell the evolution in shape over centuries and hence to date them, sometimes just from the iconography alone. These Batu Aceh are undoubtedly of local manufacture, but in North Sumatra, you also find large numbers of intricately carved tombstones of Cambay marble and workmanship, which were brought from Gujarat in India. These have been studied by Elizabeth Lambourne, who in 2003 documented at least 15 of these tombs in Aceh in North Sumatra, and 3 at Gresik on the north coast of Java. And in fact, this is the largest existing corpus of Gujarati tombstones, Cambay tombstones in the world, because those in Gujarat itself have generally been dismantled and reused as building materials over the centuries. Now, as you can probably tell from the quality of these black and white photographs, these tombstones were photographed and documented in Dutch colonial times, but there are still many other gravestones in Aceh which are hardly known or documented. Luckily, there's a very active group of local historians in Aceh called MAPESA, this is Masyarakat Peduli Sejarah Aceh, who salvage, document and study these tombstones, and you can see the conditions in which they have to work. Aceh is a region which is very susceptible to environmental damage and disasters, such as the devastating tsunami of 2004, which completely destroyed and changed parts of the coastline and actually inundated many graveyards. So I asked one of my colleagues who works with this group, Arya Purbaya, if he could let me know of the earliest indication of the title Haji, indicating a pilgrim, found engraved on a tombstone. And he informed me that Mapesa, the group Mapesa, had recently discovered a local tombstone dated 1460, so in the mid-15th century, in Gampong Blangpa in Aceh Utara, northern Aceh, which recorded the death of someone called Haji Izzuddin, and in fact is a very clearly engraved tombstone. You can see very clearly his name, Haji Izzuddin, in the top line. Bin Ibn Haji bin Haji Ismail, but his name continues Amirabadi. So in fact, although this is the tombstone of a Haji, someone who had performed the pilgrimage, whose father had also performed the pilgrimage, he was actually not a local, but from Amirabad in Iran, near Hormuz. So this is the earliest known tombstone made in Aceh of a Haji, but it's not of a local. However, there is another tombstone, which is, although it's undated, it can be dated stylistically to the 16th century. And this is of a man whose name is Abdullah, and he has the Malay title Sri Maharaja Lela. But according to the Arabic inscription on his tombstone, he seems to have been the official in charge of the Hajj and maritime matters. So that implies that in the 16th century, the pilgrimage from Aceh was already institutionalized and organized enough to have necessitated the creation of a post of an official who was in charge of regulating it, which gives us some indication of the number of pilgrims departing regularly from Aceh. I'd now like to turn from tombstones to written evidence of the Hajj. But of course, with its tropical climate and frequent floods and fires, it's difficult to find manuscripts in Southeast Asia that date much earlier than the 16th century. However, we do have later manuscripts which preserve earlier compositions, and through careful philological study of these manuscripts, we can evaluate and date these sometimes much earlier texts. Now, in my study for written sources from Southeast Asia on the Hajj pilgrimage, I was very lucky that an extensive study had already been carried out by my colleague Henri Chambert-Loire, who in 2013, with the collaboration of a large number of scholars, published a 3-volume compilation of Malay and other Indonesian accounts of the Hajj pilgrimage, dating from 1482 to 1890. With a really masterly and wide-ranging introduction, which looked not only at accounts of the Hajj itself, but also at references to and views about Mecca as the holy city and the center of the Muslim world. So from Chambert-Loire's survey, it appears that the earliest known Malay account of the Hajj is found in one of the most famous Malay tales, the Hikayat Hang Tuah, the story of Hang Tuah, who was the Malay admiral of the 15th century Kingdom of Malacca, which at the time was the greatest Malay sultanate and the richest port in the whole of Southeast Asia. So Hang Tuah is the Malay culture hero. He's an exemplary warrior who is renowned for his loyalty to the king, and he combines the style and panache of other epic figures such as Rustam or Rollo or Lancelot in the English tradition. Now, Malacca was, of course, captured by the Portuguese in 1511, and the Hikayat Hang Tuah is believed to have been composed about 2 centuries later in Johor in the 17th century, to try and evoke and capture the splendor of Malacca and to perpetuate the memory of its greatness. It was a very popular tale, and over 30 manuscripts are known, but most of these date from the 19th century. I think there might be one from the 18th or possibly the 17th century. And in this story, Hang Tuah is asked by his master, the Sultan of Malacca, to lead a delegation to Rum. Rum is, of course, the Malay word for the Ottoman kingdom, so the Ottoman Empire, and in this case, the Ottoman capital of Istanbul or Constantinople is known in Malay sources as Rum. Now, at this point, I should point out at this juncture, I should point out that to read the Hikayat Hang Tuah, like any other epic, should be approached with keenly critical faculties. At the time of its composition in the 17th century, Johor's great rival was Aceh, and Johor very much resented the fact that Aceh would not help it and assist in yet another assault on Portuguese-held Malacca, because Aceh had in fact already attacked Malacca twice and had suffered, major defeat in the early 17th century, and Johor wanted Aceh to join with it again in another attack on Malacca, and at that point Aceh held back. And so the literary scholar Vladimir Braginsky has proposed that the account of Hang Tuah's journey to Rum in the Hikayat Hang Tuah is actually a very brazen borrowing, or you could say appropriation, by Johor of the various Achenese embassies directly to Istanbul, to the Ottoman world in the 16th century. So the Achenese experience has been transplanted into a Johor Malay story of Malacca. So to return to the Hikayat Hang Tuah, so on Hang Tuah's voyage to Rum, he travels up the Red Sea in his boat and stops at Jeddah. And since it happens to be the right time for the Hajj, he is invited by the governor of Jeddah to perform the Hajj, which he duly does. And a detailed description in the Malay story follows of all the Hajj rituals, including at the end the replacement of the kiswa, the curtains surrounding the Kaaba. And the old kiswa is divided up for sale, and Hang Tuah himself buys a piece, which is the largest piece he could get. So it says, "Maka Laksamana pun membelilah tirai itu barang sedapatnya." And this, in the Hikayat Hang Tuah, this Hajj episode is dated very precisely, 9th of Zulhijjah, 886, equivalent to the 29th of January, 1482. But this is the only date in the entire large Hikayat. And for this and other reasons, including some errors and omissions in the description of the Hajj rituals, Chambert is convinced that this entire episode is another interpolation into the story, and that it has been inserted into the Hikayat Hang Tuah to enhance the Islamic credentials of the epic. But this insertion itself, even though it might not have been created by the author of the Hikayat Hang Tuah, it's an original account in itself of the Hajj in 1482, which either would have been written originally in Malay or translated from Arabic. So this episode is in itself of great interest as a very early account of the Hajj linked to the Malay world. So in Chambert survey of references to the Hajj in Malay and other sources, including in Javanese and other languages, he quickly identifies a rather strange ambivalence, because on the one hand, in all the royal chronicles, whether it's Hikayat Rajapasai, Sejarah Melayu, or tales like Hikayat Hang Tuah, there is fulsome praise paid to Mecca as the great source of Islamic authority. So it's the Sharif of Mecca from whom opinions are sought, and the great authorities of Islamic reasoning are always held to be in Mecca. On the other hand, there is no direct evidence or even interest shown in these chronicles by local rulers of undertaking the Hajj themselves. Now, the most usual reason cited is the long time taken and how long they would need to be away from the throne, which might not be securely held in the meantime. However, at the same time, in the 15th century, on 5 occasions, the Sultan of Malacca traveled to China to pay tribute to the Chinese emperor, and these were also very long journeys, but no Sultan of Malacca ever undertook the Hajj. So Chambrelois has traced a number of formal justifications in Malay texts for rulers not undertaking the Hajj. One very famous text is the Tajus Salatin, or Crown of Kings, which is a mirror for princes based on Persian and Arabic models, which was composed in Aceh in 1603. And in this work, in a chapter on justice, a devout king announces to his ministers that he would like to undertake the Hajj. However, his ministers beg him not to go. Instead, they tell him that there is a pious Haji in the country who has lived in Mecca for many years and has brought back with him the benefit of 60 Hajj pilgrimages. And they suggest that the king could simply buy the benefit of one of these pilgrimages from the Haji. So the king goes to see the Haji and tries to buy a Hajj pilgrimage benefit from him. But the Haji tells him that despite his riches, he will never be able to afford to buy one of these pilgrimages unless he treats one single man in his kingdom with justice and leaves him satisfied. And in that case, the king will have earned the right to buy all the 60 pilgrimages many times over. And so the message in this text is clear, that the role of the king in dispensing justice at home to his subjects is more important than the undertaking of the Hajj. However, if Malay sultans themselves did not undertake the Hajj, many others from Southeast Asia did, and the biggest group were Islamic scholars and intellectuals from every island in the archipelago who flocked to the holy cities of the Hijaz to study Islam. Now, these scholars came from all over the archipelago, from all these different islands, Sumatra, Java, Borneo, Kalimantan, Sulawesi, Mindanao, and Sulu, speaking a wide range of different languages, from Achinese, Minangkabau, Sundanese, Madurese, Wolio in Ton, even Tausug in the Sulu Islands. But they were united through their use of the Malay language. That was used as the language of the whole of this region for purposes of trade, for purposes of diplomacy and communication, and crucially for the spreading of Islam in Southeast Asia. And so that is very much why and this is a map, the map that I'm showing here is perfectly entitled A Map of the Countries Wherein the Malayu Language is Spoken. It's from the first Malay English dictionary published in London in 1701. And this is what we call the Malay world of Southeast Asia. So when these Islamic scholars traveled to Arabia, the Arabian Peninsula, when they arrived there, they were called in Arabic the Jawa, after the island of Java. But the name, the Jawa, was applied to all, it took on a generic meaning of all Muslims from Southeast Asia. And so the nisbah, or name element, al-Jawi, came to be applied to all the resident Southeast Asians in Mecca and the Arabian Peninsula, and their language was termed Bahasa Jawi, or the Jawi language, meaning the Malay language. And many of these scholars spent long periods, decades, in the holy cities studying Islam before returning to their home islands to pass on their teachings to other people. And this network has been studied by Azumardi Azra and other scholars who've talked about this jaringan ulama, so this network of scholars, particularly in the 17th and 18th centuries. One of the most prominent of such scholars was from Aceh, Abdul Rauf of Singkil, who spent nearly 40 years in Mecca and Medina, also studying in the Yemen, before finally returning to Aceh to take up his post as the chief spiritual authority in the kingdom during the reign of the first queen, Sultana Tajul Alam. And he wrote many works, including this work shown here on fiqh, the Mirat at-Tulab, but he was also, he's most famous because he wrote the first Malay commentary, complete commentary on the Quran. And he was also renowned because he had an assistant whose name was, we don't know much about him except for his name, Baba Daud al-Rumi. And from that name, we assume that he had Ottoman blood or his forebears came from the Ottoman realm. So again, a clear marker of Ottoman links with the Malay world during that time. Another very famous scholar from Southeast Asia who also spent at least 2 decades in Mecca and Medina and also traveled as far as to Damascus and to the Yemen for his study of Islam was Sheikh Yusuf, originally from Makassar. When he returned from the Middle East to Southeast Asia, he took up a post in Banten as advisor to the Sultan of Banten, but he was, during the war with the Dutch, he was captured and exiled first to Sri Lanka and then to the Cape in South Africa. And he is really credited with developing Islam in South Africa. But the important thing here is his seal, which is inscribed very clearly, Sheikh al-Hajj, Yusuf al-Taj. Al-Taj refers to his Sufi title, Al-Tajul Khawati. So he was granted the title by his master in the Khalwatiya Tariqat, which he obtained the Ijazah, the certificate of that in Damascus. But this is the earliest seal. It's dated 1088, 1677. It's the earliest Malay seal with the title Haji on it. So it's a real marker that we don't always hear from these scholars that they performed the pilgrimage while they were studying in the holy cities. But we assume, of course, that they must have, and we have proof on Sheikh Yusuf's seal that he certainly had performed the pilgrimage. So the scholars undertook the pilgrimage. We don't have evidence that the rulers did, but even if the rulers did not undertake the pilgrimage, their courts were important centers of dissemination of information about the situation in the holy cities, and prospective pilgrims would usually request permission from the ruler to undertake the Hajj. So this is the personal diary of the Sultan of Bhone in South Sulawesi, Ahmad As-Saleh Shamsuddin, which is written in Bugis language and script. The Bugis tradition of keeping court diaries, which is an exceptional historical resource that we don't find in other Malay world kingdoms, it probably started under European influence, probably from the Portuguese or the arrival of the Portuguese. So the solar calendar, the Gregorian calendar, is used rather than the Hijra calendar. So you can see that these pages are for 1782 for the months of January and February. But something which I've only more recently realized is a very strange, again, Ottoman influence, that the Ottoman Rumi calendar is used for the names of the months. So here we have Kanunisani for the first month and Subat for the second month. So rather than the Hijra months, the names of the Muslim months, we have the Ottoman names used, which must imply a degree of Ottoman administrative and organizational influence in the court of Bhone at that time. So these Bugis court diaries are set out like an office diary with 1 page per month, 1 line for each day of the month. But if you had a very busy day, the writing would have to go up in a spiral, as you can see, like a labyrinth, to use the amount of space available. So some days were quite quiet, but other days were extremely busy. And in an entry in this diary for May 1780, we find that on the 17th of the month, a note from the Sultan that he gave a prospective pilgrim to Mecca La Panuk a sealed permit, and on the 22nd of that month, the pilgrim took his departure for Mecca. Now, the diaries are written in Bugis, but they're in Bugis language and script, which reads from left to right, but occasionally you find words in Arabic, so you can actually see the word Hajj here on the 17th, and it starts Alhamdulillah and Al-Hajj, and so Hajj here in the entry for the 22nd. Now, this manuscript, like many other royal Bhone diaries, which are now held in the British Library in London, are part of the Royal Library of Bhone, which was captured by the British in an attack on the court of Bhone in 1814 and entered the collection of John Crawford. So John Crawford was an East India Company official who was fluent in Malay and Javanese and who's writing a book on the history of on Southeast Asia, the Malay world of Southeast Asia. But he did not know Bugis, so he commissioned Malay translations of important entries from the Bhone diaries. And this is an extract from one of the Malay manuscripts which he had commissioned as translations from the Bhone diaries. And this is an interesting account of a visit to the court of Bhone in 1806 by an honoured guest from Mecca, Ibrahim Zain al-Abidin, who reports on the Wahhabite actions and attacks in Mecca and Medina, demolishing venerated tombs, demolishing everything save for the tomb of the Prophet himself. And so we do see how the royal courts in the Malay world acted as points for the exchange of information from the outside world through the travelling and the coming forth and back of visitors. Malay rulers also played a very important role in that they were instrumental in negotiating passages for prospective pilgrims to Mecca on visiting foreign ships, including ships of the East India Company. And so this was one of many letters to Francis Light, who was the, at the time, still just a British East India country trader working with the East India Company before the settlement of Penang by the East India Company. So this is a letter from the Sultan of Selangor on the west coast of the Malay Peninsula, asking for Francis Light's help in organising passage for a prospective Hajj pilgrim on a ship to Bengal, from where, he could take another ship and eventually make his way through to the Middle East. Those who were unable to make the pilgrimage themselves in their lifetime would sometimes hope to be able to gain the benefit by leaving money in their wills for others to undertake the pilgrimage on their behalf as a proxy pilgrimage. And there are a number of wills in the Malacca records in the British Library which leave funds specifically for this purpose. So this is a will from Malacca dated 1814 of a woman, a wealthy woman called Zainia, who leaves funds and she appoints as her executor Encik Rantu or Rantau, and she leaves money for 7 pilgrimages to be carried out, firstly on her own behalf, secondly for her mother, and she names 5 other relatives, one presumes, for whom funds will be paid if proxy pilgrimages can be carried out on their behalf. And she also instructs her executor to sell a house in Malacca in order to establish an endowment, a waqf in Mecca for the benefit of poor pilgrims. Now, this was a centuries-old tradition of establishing in Malay rumah waqaf, so charitable hostelries in Mecca, for the benefit of pilgrims from specific parts of Southeast Asia, often endowed by the ruler or rich patrons from the region. And such rumah waqaf are often mentioned in Malay chronicles and other texts. So this is a manuscript of the genealogy of the rulers of Brunei, the Silsila Raja Brunei, and the author of this text was the Khatib of Brunei, Khatib al-Hajj Abdul Latif, and he was the senior Islamic official of the realm, and he makes it clear that he personally made the pilgrimage to Mecca in 1806 and purchased a house to endow in Mecca. And in his anthology on the Hajj, Henri Chamberlain also gathered sources referring to rumah waqaf established in Mecca for the benefit of pilgrims, specifically from Aceh, from Pontianak, from Langkat in East Sumatra. So these are all rumah waqaf which were established by either the rulers or rich people from those particular regions to benefit pilgrims from those regions. Now, the modern age of the Hajj really began in the early 19th century with the introduction of the steamship, which greatly shortened journey times from Southeast Asia to Arabia. And at this point, I'd like to introduce a very important name, Abdullah bin Abdul Qadir Munshi from Malacca, who is one of the most famous and influential Malay writers of the 19th century. He was a very original and perceptive observer of a swiftly changing world, who was quick to embrace new technologies and new world views. He was a professional scribe from a young age. His father was also a scribe. And as a youth, he learnt the new art of printing from Christian missionaries in Malacca. He's also been termed the first Malay journalist because of his eyewitness style of writing. He wrote about what he saw around him, which is quite a different style of writing from that found in most Malay writings of the period. So as can be seen in this little piece that he wrote, which was printed in this was first printed in 1841. This is the second edition, 1843, of the Chutra Kapal Asap, the story of the steamship. And this describes his visit to a steamship which came into Singapore in 1841. He went aboard it and he wrote of his amazement at everything he saw on board that ship. After a lifetime of working and writing the first Malay autobiography, Abdullah himself embarked on a steamship to undertake the Hajj to Mecca in 1854. And true to character, he wrote a long record of his journey, and he writes of his rapture at his sight of the holy city. But shortly after arriving in Mecca, he fell ill and he died there. And his account of the journey was only published posthumously in 1850. He died in 1854, and in 1858 it was published in, it's called the Kisah Pelayaran Abdullah, the Voyage of Abdullah to Mecca, and it was published in a missionary journal, Cermin Mata, published by Benjamin Keasbury in 1858. So Abdullah had written of the difficulties of his long voyage and the terrible weather, and that all the pilgrims thought they were going to die if the ship sank. But in fact, others on the pilgrimage faced more overtly hostile treatment. So this is a document which is held in the Ottoman archives in Istanbul, which was discovered through the recent British Academy project, Islam, Trade and Politics Across the Indian Ocean, about which we'll be talking in a few days' time. This is a petition addressed to the Ottoman governor of the Hijaz, which is bears the seals of 63 pilgrims from Aceh and Kerinci in Sumatra, protesting at their treatment by the Dutch and asking for action to be taken. Now, it's very interesting with this use of seals, because in the Malay world, the use of seals was reserved for royalty and court officials only. Ordinary people didn't have seals. We know that because Munshi Abdullah, in his autobiography, was commissioned to design a seal for a newly ennobled court official. But Abdullah himself prepared his will before he set off on the Hajj, and even his own will is not sealed. And that really shows that ordinary people who are not court officials did not have or use seals. But in other parts of the Islamic world, such as in the Ottoman world, in India, in Egypt, everybody at every level of society had a seal and needed it to transact any official business at all, such as a petition. And so the fact that all the seals on this petition look alike, and here's one you can blow up, and they're all dated 1289, the same date, implies that these seals were all made by the pilgrims on arrival in the Hijaz, and they're made they're very Ottoman in style, in calligraphy, and in shape, and in form. And so they had seals made on arrival in order to submit an official petition according to established Ottoman government protocol. Now, as the number of pilgrims to Mecca increased with easier and shorter journeys, they needed guides and maps to help them prepare their journey. This is a very rare manuscript map of Mecca produced in Aceh, And on the back of it, we have a long text in Achenese describing Mecca and describing all the rituals of the Hajj linked to the exact monuments. This is probably late 19th century, around maybe 1860s, 1870s. Only about 3 decades later, but seemingly from a much more recent period, is this small guide in Malay on the Hajj. It's a guide written in Malay for pilgrims, which was printed using typeset, a typeset press in Singapore in 1900. When the pilgrims arrived in Mecca, they were usually taken charge of by a number of sheikhs who each had responsibility for pilgrims from different parts of the world. So these are 2 of the sheikhs for the Malay pilgrims in Mecca, photographed by Christian Snoek Gronje, who is a name which is intimately associated with Mecca. Snoek Gronje was a Dutch scholar who converted to Islam and visited Mecca in 1884, and was the first person to take photographs of Mecca, and he wrote a book on Mecca, which he paid particular attention to pilgrims from Southeast Asia. So it's a really valuable source for the experience of pilgrims in Southeast Asia at that time. He also photographed many groups of pilgrims from different parts of present-day Indonesia, the Malay world, at the Dutch consulate in Jeddah. And he describes in his fascinating book that pilgrims from the Malay world often had a particularly difficult time in Mecca while on the Hajj, because they were cheated and picked upon mercilessly. And this is because it was generally known that they couldn't speak Arabic, and because they had come from such long journeys, and so many of them were carrying money either for the needs of their journeys or to carry out these proxy pilgrimages on behalf. They were given commissions by relatives and others. The sharks knew that they had funds, and because their understanding of Hajj rituals was so limited, often unscrupulous locals would make up fake rituals and charge the pilgrims for the undertaking of these extraneous rituals. On their return to Southeast Asia, of course, the pilgrims were welcomed home with great pomp, and even to the present day, these are pictures from contrasting a century apart in Surabaya in the 1880s, setting off on the next leg of the return journey to the K Islands in Maluku. And the top picture is from Brunei in the 1970s with a ceremonial arch welcoming a pilgrim back from the Hajj. When pilgrims returned, of course, they brought back souvenirs and mementos. Zamzam water to the present day would always be carried, but some of these souvenirs were much more high-end. For example, in the richest pilgrims might be lucky enough to get a piece of the kiswa, and this is a very fine jacket made for one of the Patani royalty, princes of the royal family in southern Thailand. Pilgrims also brought back certificates and maps of the Holy Land. You can see that in the tropical conditions of Southeast Asia, these were greatly treasured, even if they didn't always didn't survive over the years so well. So this is a copy of a map brought back from Mecca, it's held in a private collection in Kerinci in province of Jambi in central Sumatra, and was only digitized in 2007. So it was at least 100, maybe 140, 50 years old at that time. And other typical souvenirs that were brought back were talismanic charts, and of course books and manuscripts such as copies of the Quran. And at this point, I'd like to ask, so what impact did Ottoman arts have on the book arts of the Malay world after so many centuries of contact? And particularly, the contact was mostly through the melting point of Mecca. That there might have been some contact with Istanbul, but much more often was contact through the cities of the Haramain in Arabia. We certainly have evidence of a few Malay calligraphers and artists in Mecca who are studying in the Ottoman style. So one of the finest examples known is a prayer book, a Kitab Maulid, which is now held in the Islamic Arts Museum, Malaysia, in Kuala Lumpur. And it's copied in superb Ottoman style calligraphy and illuminated in an Ottoman style, but the name of the scribe is Ibrahim al-Hulusi al-Sumbawi, so from Sumbawa in present-day eastern Indonesia. Although this prayer book is not fully dated, what is very important, and it's also held in the Islamic Arts Museum in Malaysia, is a letter in Malay with quite a lot of Arabic from somebody called Abdurrahman from Kelantan. This is his seal, it's blown up here, his seal is Abdurrahman. And he writes in this letter to the Sultan of Pontianak. He's writing from Mecca, and he says that he is studying Ottoman calligraphy. He's studying Menurat Istanbul. He's studying how to write in the Istanbul style. And he names as his teacher the late Ibrahim al-Hulusi. So he was studying with this scribe, the scribe who wrote this prayer book. So we do know that there was a little coterie of Malay scholars studying Ottoman calligraphy. This is in the Sultan's mosque, the Masjid Sultan on the island of Penyengat, in the Riau Islands, just south of Singapore. And it's held in the mosque. There is a very fine Quran, illuminated Quran, and the explanation label states that it was written by somebody called Abdurrahman Istanbul. I don't think he's not the same as the previous one who's from Kelantan, because this one came from the island of Lingga, and he was sent by the government of Lingga to Cairo to study Ottoman calligraphy, and it's called, it mentions here, Gaya, study Khat Gaya Istanbul. So this Quran is said to be by his hand, and yet I think it would be quite important to have the opinion of an expert on Ottoman calligraphy to state whether this hand is indeed recognizably influenced by an Ottoman style or not, because from the aspect of illumination, it's a very typically Malay Quran in the East Coast style, strongly influenced by the art of Trengganu on the East Coast. So in fact, to be honest, what is perhaps surprising is that it's quite rare to find clear examples of Ottoman-inspired calligraphy in the Malay world. Much more common is the continuation of traditional calligraphic and decorative styles associated with regional traditions from the Malay world, which continue to be practiced even in Mecca itself. So here are two examples of typically Malay illuminated manuscripts, which were actually produced in Mecca at a time when it was under Ottoman governance. But these manuscripts are produced in a purely Southeast Asian idiom. So at the top we have a manuscript in Malay called Kitab Hikam, which is decorated in the Achenese style. This is a typically Achenese headpiece, and it was copied in 1855 in the Rumah Aceh. So it's one of these Rumah Wakaf. It's a hostel for the Achenese pilgrims in Mecca. And here below we have a manuscript beautifully illuminated in the Trengganu style, but it was copied in Mecca in 1874 by a Patani scribe, but it's written in Mecca. So we note that this ambivalence of that there is Ottoman influence, and there were Malays who went to Mecca to study in the Ottoman style, but the deep attachment to their own traditions from the evidence of manuscripts exerted a stronger influence. But we also know that notice that perhaps it's the fact that even in Mecca that the Southeast Asians, the Malays, tended to congregate together and to stay in their own communities, in their rumah wakaf, which perhaps provided a suitable environment for the continuation of their own traditions. However, one aspect of manuscript art, which even if manifested in a local artistic idiom, was probably introduced into the Malay world through an intermediary Ottoman lens, is the illustrations in copies of the very popular prayer book Dalail al-Khairat, which was a prayer book composed by a Moroccan writer Al-Jazuli in the 15th century. And these prayer books typically contain illustrations of the tomb of the Prophet and his companions Abu Bakr and Umar in Medina in the Prophet's mosque. And they are usually reproduced in a very stylized form of 3 rectangles in a slightly overlapping row. So this is an example from Selangor in the 18th century. Later copies of this prayer book usually balance depictions of Medina on the left-hand side, and you can still see the 3 tombs here, with depictions of Mecca on the right-hand page. So although this prayer book was composed in Morocco, it became very popular in the Ottoman world, and doubtless it spread into Southeast Asia through that Ottoman lens. And it's a very important prayer book in connection with the Hajj, because these depictions of Mecca and Medina in the prayer book probably had a great impact on popular imagination and evoking the image of Mecca and Medina that was familiar in the Malay world. So this is a copy probably from Patani on the east coast of the Malay Peninsula. There are many other copies known from Southeast Asia. This is a sumptuous copy, which is probably produced in Terengganu, very heavily gilded. Again, we can see the 3 tombs here and the mimbar of the Prophet from Medina on the left and the Kaaba in Mecca on the right. And this is a royal copy from Palembang. It belonged to one of the sultans of Palembang in the early 19th century. And this is quite unusual, as these drawings are found not in a copy of the Dalail al-Khairat, but they're found in a Quran from Aceh. This is the only Quran manuscript known with these illustrations of Mecca and Medina in a Quran manuscript. But this is probably one of the finest examples known. It only has images from Medina, and so you have the tombs on the right-hand page and the mimbar of the Prophet in a very stylized form on the left-hand page. So this manuscript was probably created in Patani or Kelantan in either the late 18th probably or the early 19th century. It's one of the most perfectly judged examples of Malay manuscript art, and it was a source of great pride to find that this manuscript was included in the seminal exhibition at the British Museum in 2012 called Hajj, Journey to the Heart of Islam. And this was a section of the exhibition which was devoted to the Prophet's Mosque in Medina. And you see, so alongside an Ottoman textile, which was made on the orders of Sultan Selim for the Prophet's Mosque in 1803, there's an exhibition case here with 2 massive brass candlesticks on loan from the Benaki Museum in Athens, which were made by the 15th century Mamluk Sultan for the mosque in Medina in 1482. And there's a 17th century Turkish tile from depicting the sanctuary at Medina. But in the middle is this small, beautiful Malay manuscript of the Dalail al-Khairat. And it was very, very significant for Southeast Asia, because this is a region which is normally wholly neglected or relegated to the periphery in exhibitions or discussions on Islamic art. So to see a Malay illuminated manuscript in this exhibition, and indeed at the very heart of the world of Islamic art, was a really moving experience. And its presence here in this case also bore witness to the fact that for centuries Malay pilgrims from Southeast Asia have been an integral part of the Hajj. So on that note, I'll end my talk. So thank you. Teşekkür ederim. Terima kasih.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for this really, good and in detail presentation, Dr. Gallup. It was really informative. From the royalties to the ordinary people of the Southeast Asia, you shared many different and various images with us and told us a different story of Hajj maybe. It's the same story, but through the manuscripts, the old documents, it was really rich and colorful for us. Thank you. Maybe, there is one question about your presentation. For example, you told us that the influence, artistic influence of the Ottomans actually, in compared to the traditional one, was, rare. If we consider the regional differences, can we say that some regions, in compared to the others, were, more influenced by the Ottoman artistic influences?
Yes, I think the area which was most strongly influenced actually was the east coast of the Malay Peninsula. Terengganu, Patani, Kelantan was much stronger. You really don't see Ottoman influence at all strangely enough, in the manuscript art of Sumatra, even in Aceh, it's not evident at all. But you do see it quite strongly in Patani and say Terengganu, albeit reabsorbed into a Malay style. So there are a number of features. One is that they're in the page layout of the Quran. So there was an Ottoman model of how of laying out a Quran manuscript, which was developed in the 17th century, which was a very clever system, which worked out that you could fit one juz of the Quran onto exactly 10 folios of paper, which is 20 pages. So you always had the first line of a new juz at the start of a right-hand page, and on every page there would always be a complete number of ayah, of verses. And this was especially good for memorizing the Quran by heart, because you could picture, it was always on all manuscripts, the same amount of text was on each page. And this model is followed very accurately in all Qurans from Patani and Terengganu. You always find this Ottoman model of page layout. So even when the style of decoration is Patani style, you would find that the model has been borrowed from the Ottomans. Now, you don't find this in Aceh. So in Aceh, they just started to write the Quran, and some people had bigger handwriting and some people had smaller, so the number of pages would vary. But in Terengganu and Patani, Kelantan, you would always have exactly the same number of pages. Now, you see a little bit in Java, so sometimes the Ottoman model is absorbed in Java, sometimes not. In the Illumination, also, there is some awareness of Ottoman influence in Patani and Terengganu. There is, I can't speak Turkish, but there is a name for a particular, it's TIG, T-I-G. It is a particular element of illumination where there's a small ray coming out from the illuminated frame. And it's when you see it in some Malay style Qurans from the East Coast, it is done in blue or red ink. And this is a very clear, it's Ottoman influence, very similar to what you find in Ottoman manuscripts, because the Malay world tradition is not to draw in different colored inks, but always to use black ink for the outline, and then you put the colors in, and that is what you find in Aceh or in Minangkabau, for example. But sometimes for the use of drawing rays in a pastel pigment, I think comes from the Ottoman style. So yes, there is more Ottoman style, but not where you'd expect it. You might expect it in Aceh, but it's not obvious in the book arts of Aceh.
Thank you so much again for your time and this really good presentation, Dr. Gallup. And for our audience, the recorded version of this presentation will be available very soon with Turkish subtitles as well. And again, kind reminder for all the audience, Dr. Gallup will join us again on next Thursday for the webinar on the project Islam, Trade and Politics Across the Indian Ocean with Professor Andrew Peacock and Professor Ismail Akikade. And we will have Dr. Gallup's talk again on Thursday. Thank you for watching us. Thank you, Dr. Gallup, for joining us today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nathan.
Okay, Dr.